And I'm now going to seamlessly transition into introducing our next speaker for this afternoon. So Zachary Ardern is our speaker. He is a postdoctoral fellow in evolutionary microbial genomics. He's originally from New Zealand. He's now based in Cambridge. He's done some work on COVID-19, looking at the genes in the virus, but also looking at the kind of science-informed response by Christians to COVID as an example. He's also received the Oliver Barclay Award last year from CiS. So yeah, I know we're in for a real treat this afternoon. He's going to be speaking to us on facts and faith versus fake news. So Zachary, over to you.
Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks for the introduction. It's a great privilege. I'll just try and share my screen. Okay, great. Yeah, I've really enjoyed the talk so far. So they set a really high standard, which I don't expect to meet, but I hope it's still interesting. Right, so I think you can see the right screen. Okay, great. So this is a slightly difficult topic, like some of the other ones that have been addressed as well, and that I think it is a bit challenging to think through how to deal with a lot of the disinformation which we come across either personally from friends of ours or just in general. And I think it's a really important ethical topic, which is the reason I suggested it as a topic for our conferences. Because I think one of the responsibilities that has come up a couple of times is that as Christians in science, we do have a responsibility to communicate clearly and to communicate the truth. And part of that is responding to disinformation, to things that are not true. I thought maybe a helpful way to start this is just with this prayer that I came across. So I'll just let you read that silently, and I'll actually come back to it later as well. I think this is just a good attitude to approach this topic with. And it's actually listed in this really helpful booklet that I'll also come back to later, which has some really expert advice. I'm not a social scientist or an expert in any of these things, but some people who really studied these things really carefully. It's from ISCAS, which I guess is like a sister organization to CiS in Australia, who have put together this really helpful booklet on responding to disinformation and conspiracy theories from Christians or in Christian community. Okay, so lots of things to say about this, but these are just some of the kind of difficult issues that we face, either in the media or sometimes from other Christians or sometimes from non-Christians. In the middle, there's the idea that science and religion are inherently in conflict, and we hear this both from atheists like Jerry Coyne, but also often from Christians. And there's all kinds of disinformation on social media, untruths that are given by Christians or by atheists about science, about the relationship of science and faith, about various scientific claims. So all kinds of kind of negative and challenging things to deal with in this area. But what do I aim for in this talk? Well, I aim to try and encourage us as Christians in science to pursue a public Christianity which leverages science for the public good and for building up the church. And I think we can do, I really think we can use science in this positive way. So I hope this is kind of just a little adjustment that we can make together individually and to our communities to more effectively be Christians in science. So three main points I wanted to go through. Firstly, just introducing the ideas of facts and faith and how I think they interrelate and what I'm meaning when I say these things. Secondly, the more difficult things are some examples of fake news or disinformation that we'll often come across. And lastly, some quick thoughts on broad ways in which I think we can start to respond to these things. As a couple of the other speakers have already said, this is very much kind of a work in progress and things that I've been thinking through, and was really triggered through the COVID pandemic, just the huge amount of misinformation and disinformation that was around that I ended up having some role in addressing in a very small way. Okay, so the first topic, facts and faith and how they relate. So as a scientist, I'm very interested in facts. A specific tiny subset of facts that I'm particularly interested in. And these are facts about how and why DNA and RNA evolves and what it does in bacteria and viruses. So DNA mutates, which is a simple fact of life. And following on from that, these different variants that are created are differentially inherited, that they spread through populations in different ways. So the kinds of things that I'm looking at in my research are, why do different sections of DNA evolve differently? Why do they spread differently through the population? Why do they mutate differently? And what can we learn from all this? And I think we can learn all kinds of interesting biological things. The titles on the left are just some examples of the kind of evolutionary work that I'm involved in, just in case maybe you're a student, you're interested in this. I'd be very happy to talk about anything here if anyone's interested in molecular evolution. But basically, I'm interested in how viruses and bacteria and sometimes other things are evolving, and what we can learn about the different rates of evolution that are happening in different genes in bacterial and viral genomes. And part of that has been looking into SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID. So these facts that I happen to be researching also happen to be linked to some issues which are controversial in some areas, including sometimes for Christians. And this fact that they're controversial has led to me speaking and writing on these issues. So various things here are potentially controversial, but for instance, is evolution really a fact? Can I talk about evolution in the realm of facts, or is it something else? And if it were a fact, would that undermine Christian faith, as a lot of people believe, both Christians and non-Christians? How is COVID evolving? Why is it evolving? And do the facts that we found out about COVID give us some information on its origins, which is also, in some contexts, a controversial topic? So that was facts, the kind of facts that I happen to be particularly interested in my area of science. But then secondly, what do I mean by faith? And actually, I mean a few different things by faith, which I'll try and tease out over the talk. Firstly, of course, I mean Christian faith. That is faith in God, who's revealed himself centrally in Jesus. So this is our personal trust in God, who's revealed himself. But also there's various broader senses of faith that I think are relevant as well. So I think it's important that we're communicating in good faith. The whole area of what should we have faith in anyway? What should we trust? So faith of this broader sense of trust. I think another related area is whether we have faith in institutions or whether we have faith in each other as a society. And then also the place of faith in doing good science. So all these concepts of faith are kind of relevant to what I wanted to kind of touch on in this talk. And to get a little bit more specific here, I wanted to give just two more robust, specific applications of where I see faith playing a role in science. The first is this idea of laws of nature. And this would, can be delved into with multiple talks, and there's plenty of people who've done that. But I think there's a few ways in which faith is relevant to laws of nature, that we trust these laws of nature do hold throughout the universe, that we trust they will hold over time. So there's kind of a basic secular or non-religious sense of, but still very real sense in which people do have faith in the laws of nature. But there's also interesting questions which more closely relate to Christian theology of what are laws of nature? What should we think about them? And historically, at least, laws of nature were thought of as God's commands in controlling the universe. And philosophically, there's a case to be made that this is actually still a really potentially good account of what laws of nature really are, that there is some connection between God and laws of nature. As scientists, we work with laws of nature all the time, but we usually don't think about what they are. But I think delving into the nature of laws of nature touches on things which are relevant to faith and can be pointed towards faith. So there's a few ways in which laws of nature are related to faith. And secondly, this whole idea of peer review, which is really important in science, and also in a different way relates to faith. And that's either our faith in the system of science, our faith in individual scientists who've done the work, our faith in particular claims that are made by other scientists. And in short, I think this whole area of disinformation is basically a breakdown in faith, or a breakdown in trust, a breakdown in trust in science, or a breakdown in trust in individual scientists or particular scientific claims. So that's why I think, well, I haven't been able to do this in a really kind of neat, coherent, tidy way. I think exploring the relationship between faith and science is a really good way to approach the question of disinformation. And that's what I guess I just want to start the conversation about and encourage us to do, particularly with our Christian friends who are suspicious of science or lack trust in various scientific claims. So secondly, what do I mean by, so in light of what I've said about facts and science and faith, secondly, what do I mean by fake news, and what are some examples of that? So there's a whole smorgasbord of possible topics that you could address here. And there's probably 100 others, but these are kind of some of the prominent ones, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. There's all kinds of information floating around about vaccines. There's all kind of political and geopolitical concerns at the moment. There's questions about climate change are found in many circles. What is the scientific status of climate change? Should we trust the political establishment as inherently untrustworthy? And what about global institutions like the United Nations? What should we think about evolution and the scientific or biological establishment that supports evolution? What should we think about the scientific elite? Are they inherently untrustworthy as well? And then this last one, I just wanted to point out, it's not just Christians who have issues with trust of kind of mainstream conclusions, but sometimes atheists also have different issues that they, in atheist circles, are often matters of distrust. So did Jesus even exist? A surprising number of people think he didn't exist. So that'll be an example of disinformation or misinformation that's very widely spread in some non-Christian circles. And there's many others, of course, but there's many potential topics of disinformation, misinformation. You can pick your favorite ones as you like, but there's a couple that I've been particularly related to because they touch on my research in some way. The first is all kinds of conspiracy theories and misinformation about COVID, about where it came from, about the best way to respond to it. Some of these questions around how did COVID arise? And there's a mainstream there's a mainstream scientific view, which is held by the vast majority of relevant experts, that it probably came very recently from a related virus that's circulating in bats, and it probably came through a market in Wuhan. And there's good scientific evidence for that has been accumulating over the course of the pandemic. But there's a huge number of people who don't think that is the scientific conclusion, who aren't aware of the different lines of evidence, who don't trust whatever the scientific mainstream might say is the current scientific consensus. So there's a lot of questions around this area of where did COVID come from? And for fairly obvious reasons, people are interested in this. My research is relevant here because a lot of the relevant evidence is about the genomics, the sequence data, and what it says about the origins, particularly from an evolutionary perspective, in that SARS-CoV-2 is related to other viruses that are found in bats. And the process of explaining the origins is essentially one for evolutionary biology. So a lot of issues there. And more broadly, there's, of course, many questions around evolution. So there's many untruths that are spread by subsets of Christians around evolution. And there's a really large audience for these untruths as well. But there's also a lot of things that scientifically we don't understand about evolution. So the untruths can be on both sides to some extent. There can be severe underconfidence in what science is telling us, but there can also sometimes be overconfidence in the claims of science. So the I could say many things about evolution as well, but the main thing I'd want to say is that it's really important to be careful and nuanced and to try and avoid kind of overcompensation in responding to untruths in areas such as evolution or other controversial areas. I hope as I talk, people will have questions about specific things I'm just touching on briefly. Now, is it true that disinformation is particularly prevalent in Christian circles? And again, I'm not a social scientist. I haven't looked in depth into the social science on this, but there are some kind of fairly clear reasons why Christians are susceptible to particular kinds of disinformation in some contexts. So I don't know if there's a general claim that we can make about it, but there are specific issues where Christians are very susceptible to hearing misinformation. Some of these are general, and there are also specific issues around theological concerns with evolution, for instance. But more broadly, in many Christian circles, there is a distrust of the secular world. There can be language of oppression or persecution, which is kind of universalized. It's seen as the universal Christian experience, or as the kind of expected Christian experience to be persecuted or opposed. That can make people very suspicious of what the outside world says about controversial issues. There can be sometimes a sympathy for people who claim access to a kind of supernatural or special source of knowledge outside the kind of normal ways that we learn things about the natural world. And then there can also be what I describe as a decay narrative about world history, that things are inherently getting worse. And that also, I think, kind of feeds into certain kinds of cynicism or skepticism about claims about the nature of the world, and also distrust of institutions and people who are seen as kind of representing the kind of outside secular world and not representing Christian beliefs or interests. So I think there is good reason to think that Christians in some contexts do have more susceptibility to misinformation or disinformation on various topics. And this can lead into some challenges I just wanted to highlight. So I think each of these things is worth just briefly touching on. I think many people have what I describe as selective credulity, that they're open to believing certain things. So they're open to believing things that should otherwise they would recognize as really not well evidenced, so long as it aligns with a particular alternative narrative. So, and we're all, of course, open to this, that we have narratives that we believe in, and if evidence supports that narrative, we'll accept it very easily. There's also cynicism, which is really concerning. People who have kind of given up on our capacity to test claims and have decided that, well, since everyone disagrees on these kinds of things, you may as well just pick the one that kind of works for you. And then there's also contrarianism, which I see among many people, that the idea that if it's going against the mainstream, that inherently actually makes it more trustworthy. There's maybe not many people who would explicitly sign up to these things, but I think most of us will maybe recognize that these are trends that a lot of people kind of fall into and end up kind of sharing and being involved in. Something else, just kind of categories to hopefully help us think about some of these things, is this phenomenon that I call package thinking. And this is the idea that beliefs kind of come together as a package. And to illustrate this, I think most of us on reflection will see that we can often quite accurately predict what other people around us will come to think about all kinds of different topics based just on their politics or their demographics. And this is quite kind of scary and concerning when claims which are otherwise seem to be completely unlinked become linked in kind of a package in people's minds. The package might be something like a perceived entailments of a Christian worldview, that if you're a Christian, you have answers to all these complex topics, and it kind of all comes as a package. This is quite a dangerous way of thinking, I think, because if there's something in that package, which doesn't actually align with reality, then that makes the whole belief system really brittle and really open to being rejected in future. So against this kind of thinking, I think it's just really helpful to kind of unpack the package into separate subcompartments and see that they're not necessarily linked together. So in reality, there isn't a single Christian worldview answer to a lot of complex issues. It's not that the Christian worldview comes as a massive package with all the answers to 20, 30, 50 different topics. The same way with science or critical thinking, or there isn't a single science package that tells you all the answers to these things. So these things are more complicated. And I think just helping people to break up the package and show that these things are not actually that tightly connected can be helpful. One of the last things I wanted to highlight, this whole area of disinformation, is what I call PhD mercenaries. What do I mean by that? I Googled PhD mercenaries just to see what came up, and this was like a literal case where a professor had hired mercenaries to protect their PhD student. That's not what I mean by PhD mercenaries, though it is an interesting story if you want to look into that. PhD mercenaries are those who, those kind of lone academics who end up representing contrarian positions. And every significant contrarian position will have people with PhDs who advocate it. Otherwise, I suspect that something actually can't get to the point where it's a significant contrarian position. And these people can do a lot of damage. And unfortunately, I suspect a larger proportion than you would expect based on the population are actually Christians or claim to be Christians. Either that, or at least very many of them have very large Christian followings. And I think this is really important for Christians in science to think about carefully. How do we, as Christians who are in science, how do we respond to this? And this itself is, I think, kind of a massive area which doesn't have easy answers, but is really important because these people do so much damage. A single person with a PhD who claims that vaccines are somehow suspicious or unsafe can get hundreds of thousands of followers and can cause a lot of kind of clear empirical harm in a way which I think Christians in science can actually help to undermine if done carefully. So I think any academic is at risk of this, but the lone Christian academic is at risk of contrarianism. I think that's what's behind it. To some extent, I think when Christians are not in community with other Christian academics, with other Christian scientists, they're more at risk of this. And I think one way to reduce this kind of phenomenon is to really encourage peer review of other Christian academics, of really encouraging a culture where we could be wrong about the claims we're making. And before we make claims for a really large public audience as a Christian, we should really check with each other what we're saying. And if more people did that, I think there'd be fewer of these PhD mercenaries and less of the kind of obvious harm that does result. But I think it's a really interesting phenomenon anyway, that there are quite a few of these people who are contrarian on different issues and are Christian and have a PhD. Okay, some final thoughts on how we could respond to this. I've kind of hinted at some of these along the way. These are kind of just, maybe most of what I say is quite kind of obvious, but I think sometimes it's worth saying the obvious anyway. So there's two opposite approaches to things which we can fall into when faced with a controversial claim. One is a credulity, that we kind of believe anything. So maybe it's the selective credulity that I mentioned before, that if a particular source tells us something, we'll believe it without any questions. So that's one kind of response that we can have to a claim. The other is cynicism, that we really distrust everything. And this guy, Russell Moore, I recently heard a podcast with him. He pointed out that these are kind of two sides of the same coin, and they're both the kind of lazy option that's quite easy to fall into. So when faced with a complex, challenging, controversial area, we can easily fall into either credulity, where we'll believe anything we hear, or cynicism, where we're really skeptical and bitter about everything. But the Christian approach, I think, is to test all things and to hold fast to what is good, which is a much harder thing to do, and something that I think we really need to be encouraging those who are either really credulous or cynical into the attitude of instead testing carefully together. As I've hinted at before, I think community and connection is maybe the key answer to all this. Being personally connected to Christians with relevant expertise won't prevent all the fake news that's out there, but I think it will reduce a lot of the things that we see. I think in my experience, it definitely reduces extremism. So people who otherwise might have really extreme, controversial or contrarian views will at least tone down how extreme they are in their views if they're personally in conversation with Christians who do have some relevant expertise in the area. And somehow, fundamentally, the whole issue is about trust, who people are trusting. And it's such a difficult issue I think, for Christians in science, because a lot of people end up not trusting us, but trusting the random person on YouTube that they hear instead. And the challenge for Christians in science is, how do we promote the kind of trust that is beneficial for human flourishing, that accepts scientific facts when they are really important, and leads to more skepticism about things that people should be skeptical about, rather than skepticism of science. Part of this, the task of being a Christian Science is, I think, public Christianity, is giving a public voice to Christianity and to the relationship between faith and facts. What is public Christianity? On the left, there's Billy Graham preaching to thousands or millions of people, and that is part of what public Christianity is. But just as much what public Christianity is, the two examples on the right, Jennifer Wiseman and Francis Collins, and I should have included Catherine Hayhoe, who's been mentioned as well. These are wonderful examples of being a Christian in public in a way which communicates truth really clearly and persuasively. And we need all different kinds of people involved as public Christians. And I think this is something that many of us can be involved in, sometimes in a small way, our local community, just in our lab group, in our church, but also in a broader way. And this is something I think Christians in science can aspire to, is being public voices for communicating truth clearly. So bringing this into a summary, I think the combination of the careful use of facts in the framework of Christian faith done in community, in Christian community, is really powerful. And I think that's the best response that we have to disinformation, actually. There's lots of opportunities to speak in public as Christians in science, or even just interested in science. And I think this is something we should aspire to. It's something we should train others in, should mentor others in. And it's related to combating disinformation. And there's many opportunities in our churches, in other contexts, to correct error and to teach the truth. So with that, I come again to this prayer that I found really helpful, that I'll just pray as we finish. So, oh God, you have bound us together in a common life. Help us in the midst of our struggles for justice and truth to confront one another without hatred or bitterness, and to work together with mutual forbearance and respect through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Great. Thanks, Zachary. That was really interesting. We've had a comment in the chat, which was, kind of relating to a thought question that I was having as well. So I'm going to turn that into a question, if that's okay, John. It's talking about, it's really difficult to kind of correct conspiracy theories, particularly those that are kind of really widely believed, very well embedded. Do you have any kind of thoughts or maybe like tips on how to maybe approach those kinds of conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just what I've said really, that I think it's mostly about trust, and working out why. I think it's a long process, definitely, but working out why do people trust the random guy on YouTube more than they trust their lecturer? That's the difficult issue. But when they know us, I think this at least causes some dissonance for them. So I have friends who trust the random person on YouTube more than they trust me, but there's at least some dissonance there, and they struggle with it. And they've told me that they hear something from me and that really at least makes them rethink and challenges them. But sometimes the narrative that they're getting that's feeding their preference for the YouTube person is just so strong, it's very, very difficult to unpack. But I think, yeah, seeing it in terms of the narratives that people are buying into and the complex reasons why they might distrust science. Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't think there's an easy answer, but if someone has a simpler answer, that would be great.
Yeah, feel free to put it in the chat if you do. We've got another question. Is lack of faith in science in part due to misunderstanding about scientific processes and facts? How might you suggest we define a fact for non-scientists?
Yeah, I think a fact is something which is true about the real world that we all live in. And I think the fact we all live in the same world is the reason that we can kind of talk about facts with each other. So we do have a lot of shared ground with everyone, because everyone lives in the same world. Yeah, and that's what I see as the basis for facts. Facts are things that are true about reality, and they're not just kind of esoteric things that only experts can know about. But if something is true, then, and if someone has good reason to believe it's true, then I think we can all kind of discuss that. Yeah, I think something else is just when people don't know people who are involved in the kinds of areas that are exploring certain kinds of facts, they're more open to misinformation about that area. So just being known as a Christian in science at all is a great step for people in our churches. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think this will be our last question. It's a great one. They said, sometimes I find it harder to speak to Christians about these things than non-Christians. Do you have advice for when we're tempted to just agree to disagree without challenging conversation?
Yeah, I agree. I don't like this topic as well, because partly because, yeah, it's because often a lot of my Christian friends are really invested into some of these things. I think, I don't know, the main thing is maybe just like staying connected with people. I found like after COVID, some of these conversations are starting to happen that couldn't happen during COVID, because people were so into it then, and it was so like built into their personal identity. But now after COVID, we can all say, okay, COVID is kind of, the pandemic is kind of over in some sense. The peak of it is it's changed as a phenomenon. So we can kind of look back on the last 3 years and say, what happened there? Why did we get sucked into these YouTube rabbit trails or whatever? Yeah, so I guess just being able to have the conversation with some people we can't have the conversation with, and that's okay as well. But yeah, the combination of personal conversations and being known publicly as a Christian in science, I think opens a lot of opportunities as well. And when people realize that, I think most Christians respect they respect Christians in science. They realize that science can be kind of hostile to Christians, or there's a sense of maybe that. So when they know a Christian in science, I think that actually comes with some authority to speak into the Christian community as well. And yeah, so that is an opportunity for us.
Great. I said that was the last question, but you have time for one more. It's from Jack. How do we communicate science and faith when often these topics become so politicized that people might not listen to science and faith if what their political party thinks comes first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where our shared identity as Christians is also powerful. That not many Christians will sign up explicitly to saying, yeah, my political party comes first over my faith. So in light of that, I think that gives us kind of opportunities to talk about this within a, like, if they see that at least I think my motivation is a Christian one for doing what I'm doing, that kind of goes against a lot of the assumptions that people would have. So I just try not to prioritize the politics. I try to leave that out of it as much as possible. So then, and because I don't fit people's kind of neat political boxes, I think that's helpful. It can be helpful as well. But if you do act in a way which does fit the neat political boxes, then that makes it much easier for people to disregard what you say. So,
Great. That's great. Thanks so much, Zachary. Yeah, that was really, really good session and really interesting thoughts you've shared. I'm going to pass back over to Jack, who's going to let us know what the rest of the afternoon holds.